Hello everybody. I'm here again at the San Francisco Botanical Gardens today, and I'm at the old English walnut tree, Junglans regia in Latin. And this tree is, as you can see, it is riddled with woodpecker drillings, and I suspect that many of these are quite old. And it's astonishing because they go all the way down to the base of this tree. You can see a few, right, even down here. Yeah. So at some point in history, and I think it's a long time ago because I have never seen a woodpecker at this tree. This tree contained probably insects that the woodpeckers were feeding on, and it's astonishing. The tree is absolutely tattooed with these little holes, and it's a gorgeous and regal organism that I love. It's absolutely beautiful, and I don't know its age. You can see there's a birdhouse there. Here we have a bumblebee, which I've seen many of around lately. Not so many honeybees, however. The two primary hives here, one of them appears to be completely deserted and the other appears to have gone into some kind of state of dormancy, which is very strange. I've never seen this before. There are only one or two bees around the entrance to this hive, which is in that gigantic entrance cypress. It's in a crack in the front of that cypress. And the funnel web spider that lives below the hive near the base, the hive's about 8 feet up in a specific crack in that tree. And there's a funnel web spider in the base, but it's hard for me to tell whether that spider's still there. The hive in the cypress outside the park, outside the main gate, has been deserted for some time. I don't know what happened to it. Though both of these hives have been relatively severely affected by the diseases that are affecting hives around the world, but particularly in the United States, that involve a virus and also a mite that infects grubs, I think, while they are still in the cells. The mite is called Varroa, and this causes the bees to be born. It causes a variety of problems for the bees, I suspect. But one of the results is that bees are born either with defunct wings that don't work, shriveled wings, wingless, something like this. This gentleman here, Fred, I was just having a conversation with. He's one of the landmarks of our neighborhood, and he was talking with me about a man named Franklin Merrill Wolfe, a mystic who left Stanford because he had become too sensitive for the city and its noise, and particularly its electrical pollution, a thing most of us pay little attention to. We who are now buried in Wi-Fi and 4G and soon to be 5G networks that most corporations will claim have no significant or sensible effect upon our bodies. I see this claim as relatively impossible, and while I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I am aware that of the 35 trillion cells in our bodies, half of which are animal cells, the membranes of cells are profoundly sensitive electromagnetic gateways. And cell membranes represent an intelligence of impossible complexity. Our cells themselves are capable of performing unimaginably sophisticated filtering, transmission, and production activities with hundreds of thousands or millions of substances. They fold proteins and produce all kinds of metabolic activity that is fundamentally sensitive to electromagnetic disturbance. So it seems to me impossible that buried in the magnetic noise of our modern electronic world, that our cells could possibly be unaffected by this, without me being able to say precisely how it is they are affected. One imagines humans attempting to have a conversation, however, a coherent conversation, in a place where thousands of diesel engines are echoing. Yeah? And the impossibility of communicating in an environment like that. And I suspect that in the domain of electromagnetism, our cells are suffering something similar. When science looks for harm, and first of all, science, however dependable it may be, is very young. But when it looks for harm, it tends to look in one or two places. And there are many places that our science is not yet sophisticated enough to examine, let alone detect damage. Though I suspect that one day we will, researchers will discover that electromagnetic noise is harmful to cellular organisms, which are pretty much all of the organisms we know about. And I live in a place now where there are, 80 5-bar Wi-Fi signals where I'm trying to sleep, right? Where I live. And part of the reason I come here is to participate directly in the old living networks. Now, humans have never really discovered anything other than molecular communications among plants and animals. However, it should be clear that when sunlight shines on living things and they reflect that light, they are transforming it. Yeah. So all of this that you see here, it doesn't have to emit or create electromagnetic radiation in order to affect a medium in which signaling and reception is possible. It need only absorb and reflect certain bandwidths, which all of things that are alive, including this one, do. Although this one also communicates via sound. This is a scrub jay, what we call a scrub jay. We also have, I normally have food with me, but today I didn't bring any. I'm not actually sure if that was visible. It's hard to aim my camera. So of course everything here is communicating. Here's probably that jay's mate. Everything here is alive and is communicating in ways that don't require wires and ways that don't require high and medium frequency EM radiation like our devices do. It's funny, a little while ago, someone I work with sent me a message that their browser had been compromised and they couldn't use it on their phone. And in order to solve that problem for them, I had to have them turn off their Wi-Fi reception and their cell phone reception for a moment so that I could reset a couple of things on their phone. And when that was done, the problem was solved. There are forms of signaling and reception so foreign to our modern thought that we'd consider them to be supernatural. And this is a rather strange idea, this idea of supernaturalness. I'm not sure when it was invented or where it came from. But the meaning of the word nature depends on how we're using it and what our agendas and priorities are. If we want to talk about spooky metaphysics, then we'll pretend that nature is something like the aspects of the natural world with which we are commonly familiar. And then we can say, well, there are these other aspects that we're not familiar with that exist outside that boundary, right, that we'll call supernatural. And we think of them as having to do with something metaphysical, with spirit, with the invisible, with the world invisible to the eyes and ideas with which we ordinarily approach it. Surely, everything that is part, is an expression of nature and is thus natural from one perspective. And thus people can argue, well, our cell phones are no less natural than these trees. Because from that perspective of definition, it makes rational sense to say this. Yet it is not so. For those of us who see nature as alive and the products of us peculiar tool-using representational cognitives, we who make machines. The machines and organisms, including us, are in competition. Even though it's an artificial competition, it's a competition that arises only because we insist upon this. Human beings, human societies insist on producing objects and technologies that directly compete against our own intelligence, minds, and survival. Now, if we say that nature is everything that is and everything that is natural, then, and only then, in my mind, can we say that machines and the things that humans make are natural? I prefer, and I think it's a very important distinction to make, to think of the object produce of our cultures as artificial, man-made. Now, although we are animals, we exist in a strange between place, in a kind of limbo between nature and representation. And if you leave this garden, when I leave this garden, I will enter a world of paved streets and boxes, cars and machines, electronic transmissions and signals, none of which are healthy for me to be exposed to or immersed in, and all of which are competing against me primarily for survival, for reproductive rights, or for something that simulates reproductive rights. Cars do not reproduce, but humans reproduce them. And if you look at a city block, you'll see a thing that resembles a cell totally compromised by viruses. You'll see this paved terrain surrounding the block. You'll see cars lined up all around the block. They have something that resembles faces. Then there's another piece of pavement, the sidewalk. And there might be a little bit of living stuff, some grass or whatever. Then there's the structures of our houses. I'm near a transmitter, and I can hear the hum of it, right? I can hear the electricity transforming. Literally, there's a transformer in there, and I can hear that electromagnetic activity, because it is so overpowered compared to anything around me. There are electromagnetic signals all around us. The sun produces light, which is an electromagnetic phenomenon, but it's different in its frequencies than the lights produced by our just looking. You can see here these pollinating bodies, right, which have fallen probably from this fir tree, and you can hear the call of a hawk, and there was a crow chasing it, and perhaps you can even see the moon. The hawk has landed in a fir tree in front of me. Our world of conveniences comes with lethal costs that our societies are unprepared to evaluate, let alone cope with. And many of the bodies that we depend upon to evaluate technologies are biased because they are funded by the people who want us to adopt them. Genetically modified organisms, cell phones, gasoline, distribution networks, combustion engines, all of these things, and many others that I'll not here name, are the products of our supercultures and corporations. And there's another domain of transmission and reception that I think is important to consider. The domain of information. Ideas, evaluations, analyses, projections, predictions, concepts, language. Our species is unique in that we are formally representational cognitives. This, coupled with our uniquely structured hands, changed us. And we don't really know the story of this change. We don't know its players, though it is presumed by most of us that evolution drove the changes that resulted in the animal we are today. We are still, as a species, quite ignorant. Science as we know it, dependable though it may be in the ways that it's dependable, is profoundly new. We're talking about, depending on how you look at it, 3 to 5 generations. A veritable picosecond in terms of evolutionary time. We've only known about DNA for probably less than 100 years. And the theory of evolution itself is still very fresh, very new. So we should presume that 96% of the story is missing, and we're prone to misinterpret the 4% we have our hands on, as we often misinterpret things that we've got a very small perspective about, very, very limited amount of data on, and because our species is kind of egoic in a way, we're prone to make broad assertions, predictions, and evaluations from very small amounts of data. Now, granted, in the past, say 50 years, and with the onset of computational technology, our grasp on data has increased dramatically. But let's be clear, it still represents far less than, shockingly less than 1% of what's going on. And what's going on is so staggeringly profound that in the entire lifetime of our species, we're unlikely to get more than a 3 to 5% grasp on it. So most of what's going on is hidden. It wasn't my intention to talk today about the things I've thus far touched on, though our relationship with information was something that I was considering speaking about. Because today, in the same way our bodies are inundated with unseen electronic signals, hearing these beautiful bird calls.
We'd love to do it.
These days we are inundated with information in a way not dissimilar to how our bodies in cities are buried in unseen electronic noise. And while we've always been exchangers of information, what's going on today represents an entirely new scale of the compromise and manipulation of what I will refer to as the human cognition, the living network of all human minds on the world. That network is affected, profoundly affected, by our transmission and reception technologies and by the purposes for which we deploy and employ them. And I would argue that the vast portion of that activity is toxic. And a huge portion of it is simply false. Or, rather, is coercive. When we're born, we possess a form, a kind of intelligence that's capable of undergoing profound transformation when it's exposed to language and culture. It's capable of uptake, of taking up and formulating its own relationship with language, with ideas, with concepts, with culture, with norms, with evaluation, with authority, with judgment. And this process is invisible to most of us, though some of us make our living or are habituated to explore it in a way not dissimilar to how humans may one day, if we survive long enough, explore space. Though to be honest, I would rather see us explore this world, because in my view, this world is a living library of the intelligences that express the nature and transcendence of space-time. I noticed the other day as I walked past this stump an unusual phenomenon. There's been a raptor here, and it looks like it was feeding on a pigeon. I'm nearly sure that's what we see here. And in some ways this reminds me of what happens to that astonishingly flexible aspect of intelligence that we are born with when it's exposed to language and culture, which complexify it by dividing it. Our cerebral cortex is divided hemispherically, though there are other ways we can understand the complexity, the complex anatomy of our brains. And the cortex is only a relatively superficial layer. Yet it's profoundly impactful, and its division is profoundly impactful for us. Although both hemispheres participate in most of the activities that comprise our what I'll call our cognition, or sentience, our left hemisphere is profoundly transformed when we are exposed to language, and very active when we are speaking. So that once I begin speaking, my brain changes. And if I'm listening to language, my brain changes. Whereas if I'm silent, even for a moment, my body and my brain change. Not so very long ago, I was in the I was in the old forest at Muir Woods. A friend of mine kindly transported me there. Something that required technology and cars and even transmission technologies to accomplish. Though I might have merely walked there. And in Muir Woods there was this incredible silence. And in that silence I felt rejuvenated. For a moment. I also recall a time when there was a vast power outage that lasted a few days, I think in the 1990s here in San Francisco, and that was long before there was wireless technologies. And yet again, I felt in my viscerally this incredible silence. And there's a signal that's hard to ignore. A signal we call a siren. It's the only thing we call that. The sirens were thought to be spirits that inhabited an island whose high-pitched, we imagine whose high-pitched sounds drew sailors to their deaths or drove them mad. There are, of course, myths about this that many of us have heard something of. These are salvia flowers. And unbeknownst to many, let's see here, there we go. Unbeknownst to many, you can draw one of these flowers out from the cup of tissues that hold it and take nectar directly from the flower. And it's delicious and sage-like. So today we live in a world where we're inundated with signals, and most of them are untrustworthy. A lot of them are untrustworthy. Whereas those that we encounter in living places are of an entirely different kind. It's not that we'll never encounter conflict or disguise. Nature is full of things that emulate or disguise themselves. And in fact, animals for defense often emulate or disguise or look like other things. The rattlesnake, if you look at its face, it kind of has three faces. One that looks like a rattlesnake, one that looks like a turtle, and a smaller one that looks like a mouse. Praying mantises and other creatures have eye spots on their wings so that they can flare up and look like the face of a creature much larger than they actually are. But this kind of thing is not the same sort of deception that we get from the news, media, and our common interactions with each other in modern culture. Our minds are an environment. And it seems to me something has invaded that environment. And the sign of this invasion is representation. To make a secondary thing that is not itself relation and is transmissible, encodable, highly structured, sophisticated, complex, conceptual. Here there are many bird sounds. Sounds so unlike the machines that we're surrounded by. I find particularly disturbing machines that sound like creatures. There's a few places in the park where they've installed speakers that produce cricket sounds. I find those deeply disturbing. And I can tell the difference very easily. As animals, I think we're hungry for the signals and transmissions and relationships in living places. Machines cannot provide those. Simulating those things is unhealthy at best and catastrophically misguided at worst. So I'm very concerned about all of these things. But what I was intending to speak about today is minds. If I say the phrase a mind, I pretend to use a noun to indicate a thing, a separable, distinguishable thing that we presume is possessed locally. For example, I might say, I have a mind. Now, this is simple, ordinary, everyday language. Or I might say, I have something on my mind, as if my mind were a table on which envelopes containing things could be found. Many of our metaphors in English are quite bizarre and not much like those things to which they refer. And this is part of how language and concepts and representation can become dangerously misguided. Although I feel relatively comfortable saying I have a mind. I might say like, I have a mind to walk down to the gardens, meaning that my current mind state is oriented in a purposeful way to accomplish a goal. The language is not terribly deceptive, but neither is it terribly accurate. And that's casual language. When we speak formally, we have to be much more careful. But what I want to... I was watching a hawk. What I want to speak about is the idea that our minds are possessions. And I think this is wrong. We formed minds in concert with a family of some kind, right? Whether it was our family or even if we were adopted or grew up in an orphanage or were pressed from our homes into some kind of boarding school or other environment. We form minds in contexts with many others. And the nature of our minds is fundamentally social. If in our culture we want to punish people, ordinarily we isolate them. And there are varying degrees of isolation, from modest to severe, with what we call solitary confinement being the ultimate punishment, other than physical torture or death, murder. I've always thought that our systems of justice, what we call justice, are bizarre. I've thought they're based on concepts that have nothing to do with resolving fundamental problems or wrongdoing. Instead, they seem to magnify and elicit further wrongdoing in which all of us become complicit, either by formal agreement or passive agreement. I do not trust anything about our legal systems. They've always seemed to me to be completely misfounded. One cannot pay for a crime. Crimes are not based on accounting. They're not banking systems. Right and wrong. You can't put like right in the bank and get interest on it, or wrong in the bank and lose interest, or there's no way to pay for a crime. And this idea to me seems completely absurd and hopelessly antiquated, and the starting place of all kinds of problems, because it fundamentally misconstrues the nature of relationships and produces a bizarre artificial overlay that we become infected with as children, so that for the rest of our lives, our minds become, for many of us, sort of broken courtrooms. And that's a terrifying fate that no human being should ever be subjected to. Yes, there is wrongdoing. Yes, there is kindness and good. But accountants and lawyers and judges and courts and prisons are not the proper authorities to determine such things to us. Yeah. So I wonder if I can actually get a recording of this sound. Let's see. I think I might be able to. The sound of electricity being transmitted and transformed. It's a terrible sound, really. Something we might refer to as consciousness is being transformed by our exposure to media and information. And I can envision ways of managing this process and very intelligently structuring and engaging in it that are radically different and far more beautiful than those to which we are exposed in the yet early days of what we're referring to as the internet. And one of the things that fascinates me is that I know humans well enough to know that they never really invent anything. They simulate things they discovered in nature or derived from the observation of or participation in nature, so that I know there's an intelligent network that we're embedded in, that we participate in unconsciously most of the time, that makes the internet look like gnat feces, or even a strangely parasitic disease. We have the capacity to establish something far more beautiful, intelligent, and healthy than what we're currently subjected to. And one of my dreams is that one day we may do so. And I have some models of what that might look like. And they're shockingly profound. At least to me, of course, they are my models, so I like them. I made them. It's a big job, but it's not as big as the work we'll have to do if we don't do something smarter and more beautiful than what we have been doing. Because what we have been doing is changing the nature of what it means to be human or to have a mind. But one of the things I wanted to just touch upon is that we form minds together unless we are isolated. And technologies that isolate or factionate our people are technologies that damage, inhibit, or cruelly distort our capacity for human intelligence and beauty, wonder, awe, learning, discovery, understanding, love. It's my experience that we form minds together, and we form them according to our understandings of our roles in the contexts we can sense and become familiar with. And so if we are to have a chance to know the profound potential and opportunity associated with our human birth, we must establish contexts in which the unimaginable depth and excellence of our potential is nurtured, recognized, called forth. Rewarded, fertilized, distributed, celebrated. We have the capacity to do this. The technologies we possess today can easily accomplish these things. But right now they're largely owned by parasitic momentums with agendas whose outcomes are fearsome and dark. We live, in a sense, in the dark ages of the onset of computational technology. And yet it's possible that from this darkness, new forms of light can emerge, new forms of illumination. And one of my lifelong interests has been to understand both how things got this way, right? What are the origins of these problems and situations in our history and in the evolution of human consciousness, and how can they be addressed? And I can respond very meaningfully to such questions at length, though today it's primarily my goal to just birdwalk a bit together around some of these topics. I think it's very important to understand that we don't so much possess minds as it is that we assemble them for purposes. And those purposes are framed to us by context and our understanding, however primitive it may be, however crude it may be, of our role. When the context is extremely narrow or limited, so too our awareness, intelligence, and consciousness will become narrow and limited. And you can see the evidence of this everywhere around us in the modern information economy, where corporations vie to harvest the attention of the masses by going after the low-hanging fruit of outrage, divisive argument, factionation, false assertions, fear tactics, and the occasional frosting of something either visually attractive, sexually attractive, or photographs of nature. I'm not sure we can survive, I'm not sure nature will survive, the necessity of recording and transmitting billions of photographs per day, preserving those, backing them up, copying them. Everyone is carrying an extremely sophisticated photographic equipment in their communications devices now. This is a recent addition to my own life. For many years I resisted it, and I'm still resistant to it, philosophically. And functionally. I don't take a lot of photographs. I think everyone else pretty much has that covered. But what I'm aware of that most people don't think about is that those photographs are competing against the things we're imaging for survival, and the photographs will likely win. The energy required to take, produce, transmit, back up, copy, modify these photographs is staggering. And like the onset of cryptocurrencies, nobody's doing the math about the energy consumption yet. They don't realize that the things we're photographing can obliterate the things we're photographing. But they can. And they often do. And as time proceeds, this will become obvious, even though at the moment it's a relatively radical idea. So too, the information that we're so busy gathering in unintelligent systems and catastrophically misguided agendas is obliterating the possibility of human intelligence, certainly on the broad scale, though there will always be some exceptions. There's enough diversity among the population that some people will be resistant, and others will become intelligent by studying the problem and learn how to modify it, at least in their own lives, if not socially. I prefer that we do it socially so that everybody gets a shot at sustainable intelligence, sustainable roles, meaningful roles, so that the precious gift of our human birth and life will not be wasted serving machines and representations and ideas unworthy of even momentary consideration, let alone implementation or preservation in cultures or commerce. It may be that catastrophe will be required to help us have a chance to restart the processes that currently assail our humanity, our spirit, our essence. The beautiful bases of our existence that are truly worthy of reverence and awe, exploration and discovery. But for now, the world is at war. It's a war with an array of invaders that most of us have not yet learned to recognize, because our lexicons don't have the concepts necessary to recognize them. But please understand me when I say that human minds comprise a network. That network is an environment. And in that environment, there is something like Darwinian competition going on to dominate the transports that connect our minds and to obtain reproductive capacities within those transports. And that war, however invisible, is affecting every one of us. Our families, our histories. It's changing the meaning of history as well as determining the likely outcomes of futures. We must learn to remember how to form intelligent minds, contexts, and societies, purposes, and activities together. It's insufficient for us to be passive participants in networks whose primary produce is atrocity. And we cannot expect the societies and networks that presently exist to transform. Because when threatened, they will most likely simply double down on the structures they've already implemented. So it falls to us to invent together, whether momentarily or consistently, contexts and purposes and agreements from which new kinds of societies can emerge. And this is my dream and my hope. But even this was not the goal I had when I began this conversation. My goal was simply to highlight something very peculiar, that minds are not local possessions. We form them together. When we come together, they transform. Because when we come together, we establish and change, we establish and modulate contexts and purposes. And when we modulate contexts and purposes, the roles that we derive transform, right? Everyone has seen a group of people relatively, how shall I put it? In relatively common conversation, go, for example, to a bar, have a few drinks, and everyone turns into a comedian, right? You change the context, you add some intoxicants, people transform. We can do this without intoxicants because we are, how shall I put it? We are humans or animals hungry for something I'll call relational eros, right? The eros of relating with other minds that are both fascinating and fascinated. And this is one of the key pivots. Noticing this is one of the key pivots that can allow us to understand how to transform the contexts within which we are currently engaged. We can see what we've adopted as replacements for deep, authentic relationships, and how those were adopted and how they work. And by understanding those things more deeply, I believe that we can produce something better than intoxicants. Something as compelling as addictions are, without having to poison ourselves, right? Something as compelling as play was when we were children, and yet as effective as science is at participating in or transforming the mechanics of a situation. There's people here in different roles. One of them's talking about technology and systems and email. There's an elderly couple who are just enjoying the terrain and bird watching, and another elderly couple who are getting some exercise. And I am getting some perfume from this hummingbird sage plant, one of my favorite plants. Just love the scent of it. There's some mushrooms here. It's beautiful in the garden. Right outside this, extraordinary amounts of traffic, electronic, physical, informational, rushing around madly with much noise and little positive effect. There's so many phenomena in nature that I see that the camera absolutely cannot capture. This is one of them. There's an incredible play of light on the strandy fur of this tree. As it coruscates in the breeze. And it's exquisitely beautiful. And the camera may capture something, but there are so many features of what my eyes can do, and my eyes can do different things with this phenomenon, not just one, that the camera will never capture. And this is part of how we are deceived by the machines we've become the servants of. I'd like to see us invert that relationship, because I don't think we're going to get rid of machines. And even language is incredibly dangerous. We're not going to get rid of language. What we've got to do instead is become very intelligent about understanding the threats and opportunities implicit in these two technologies, both of which are representational. Language is cognitively representational, and machines are physically representational. These things are very, very dangerous. Right now, we cannot tell whether life on Earth will survive them, or if life does, whether we will. The atmospheric envelope of Earth is vulnerable, and one of the best metaphors for Earth that I've ever encountered is that of a cell. If that membrane is damaged or destroyed, everything here dies. But the humans are one of the most delicate of the organisms here. All the complex animals are delicate. And the complexly conserved ecologies, which all depend on relationships, extremely delicate. Life itself is opportunistic and resilient, but even given that, it's quite possible that the progress that our species claims to have made could result either in our own annihilation or the annihilation of most of the complex life on this world. And what that would mean would be that our entire history, it would change the meaning of our history if this happens, right? It will transform all of the human activity that we think of as beautiful and beautifully intelligent. It will transform that activity and render it to have led to something catastrophic. But the same is true if we make a wise move. If we can do something beautiful and intelligent together in our generation, and it's possible to accomplish something so astonishing and beautiful that it preserves the anciently evolved ecologies. It preserves our human existence, and thus renders the struggles and battles of our history meaningful. Yeah. So all of the things that we do today transform the meaning of history as well as the future. And this is a fact that gives me hope, inspiration, wonder, creativity, and awe. For I belong to life. And I am not a misanthrope. I'm an anthrophile. I believe in human beings. Even though the activities of our supercultures are terrifying and clearly abysmally misguided and wrong, we are perhaps the greatest single investment the living world has ever made. Though again, the banking terminology is not the right metaphor. We are charged with astonishing potential. But it remains to us to determine whether that potential will result in beauty or tragedy. I'm on the side of beauty. And I know you're with me in that sense. Thank you for joining me.